because we want this to be available for others. We're not going to take the time to go through and have people introduce themselves. This was promoted to 2023 Israel Riders and Israel Ride alumni, and really was meant to be kind of an Israel Ride community get-together, and for us really to hear from two people who have been an amazing part of our community for many years. Bill was with us in year one and has been with us just about every year since, which puts him
every year, yeah.
It's what every year since?
Every single year, every single ride, yeah.
Every single ride, which puts him in a very unique category. We could talk a lot about what that means, but that's a whole nother discussion. Jared is the new guy on the block. He's been with us for
10 years.
10 years.
Exactly.
Yeah.
New.
Well, compared to David and I, you're the new guy on the block. But he, again, a wonderful part of the community. The purpose today is really to have a human discussion, not a political discussion. Bill and Jared bring tremendous knowledge of the country, the people, what's happening in Israel as individuals. They know us, and that's what we want to try and go through and do. I have a bunch of questions, a number of questions that I'm going to ask them, and then we'll open it up to people who want to be in the chat and ask some questions in the chat. Hopefully we'll go have 45 minutes or so worth of content and send everybody on their way. I'm happy to tell you that we already spoke to Bill and Jared, and all of their direct families are okay, and in a good shape. But why don't you share with us? We can start with you, Bill. Where were you on October 7th, and how did everything play out for you on that fateful day?
Well, every Saturday morning before synagogue, I ride my bike up what Howie calls Meshugaim Hill, and come down and shower and go to synagogue. And it was Simchat Torah, of course, as everybody knows. And when I got to synagogue, it's Kibbutz Keturah, so it's sort of conservative, but there's people from all different. So there's some people there who are Shomer Shabbat. They wouldn't have even looked at their news, and there's some people who had. And when I walked into the synagogue, people said there's been an attack, and that the numbers kept going up. And at some point, somebody came up to me, because I'm sort of in charge of services on our kibbutz, and said, I don't think we should have festive hakafot. Like, we can do the official prayers and walk around with the Torah scroll, but none of this crazy dancing, because the kids get really wacko on Keturah. And I said, okay, but you have to talk to the kids. You have to talk to the young people who are organizing it. And they tried to keep it low key, but they didn't know the scope. Again, because a lot of the people weren't looking at their phones, or they didn't have phones in the synagogue, and they weren't looking at the news. And at some point, a few people left angrily, saying, "This is inappropriate. You're celebrating too much. There's mayhem going on." No one knew just how bad it was going to be, but after that, almost everybody was looking at their computers all day long. And we're kind of in the middle of nowhere on Kibbutz Keturah, as you know, but all of us have family who live near the Gaza Strip. All of us have family who are not, in my case, not immediate family, also in Jared's case, not immediate family who are in the army. And in the end, we all found out within 24 hours, we all knew, everyone I know in Israel knew that they had someone that they knew who had been killed or kidnapped. And of course, they also had people close to them who were also drafted that same day in synagogue. Before synagogue was over, by lunchtime, I was hearing, oh, this one's husband is going, this one's sons are being called up. So this was all the things together, how are my friends on the kibbutzim near there, and calling, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, by Sunday morning, we were all, every Jew in the world was in a different place than we were dancing with the Torah scrolls. Jared.
Yeah. Well, the end of the story, as Bill described, was, I guess, sort of is where a lot of Israelis kind of merged in terms of their experience of October 7th. The beginning of that day started, it sounds like, quite differently for me, in that I was awoken very early in the morning, like many Jerusalemites were, by the air raid siren, by the rocket siren. So before I could even, sort of get my head around anything that may have been going on, I heard the siren. And as everybody knows, you don't sort of think, what's the context, what's going on? You just, run to your safe room or to your bomb shelter. So I immediately headed downstairs. It was early enough in the morning that there weren't that many people in the bomb shelter. I'm one of those Jews in Jerusalem that disconnects from everything on Shabbat. So I wouldn't have had a phone to look at, and I didn't have a laptop to look at. So I just assumed it may have been one of those, one-off experiences that we have in Jerusalem every now and then. But very quickly, it became clear that this was going to be a little bit different because the air raid sirens continued to go off. But because I was disconnected, I didn't actually know what was happening. I didn't know the scope of the incursion, of the attack. And so I spent a good part of the day just hanging out with my family, sort of hearing rumors here and there about what was going on. But it was really only after Havdalah, when Shabbat ended, that we all reconnected to the screens and actually started to learn about the details. So luckily, I was with my family, and as an immigrant, or as a family with sort of, our kids have two parents who immigrated to Israel, so we don't have a lot of extended family in Israel, unlike most Israelis. So it was very easy sort of to define that my immediate circle, at least of emotional attachments, was not directly affected. But as I said, as the day sort of went on, the evening and the following morning, then my experience sounds like it basically merged with Bill's experience, in that, we all quickly learned who had been killed, that we were very close to, who had been at the party where the massacre took place. We had there were children of many of our close friends in Jerusalem, who either were killed or were missing that day. And then we learned of all of the folks that we know who are now still missing, presumed hostage in Gaza. And so as Saturday night becomes Sunday morning, like I said, my experience probably became very similar to those of the rest of the country, including Kibbutz Keturah.
Well, I will add that there's one thing that I'm guessing went through every Israeli mind and most Jewish minds over the world that are older than me. Let's say Howie's age or older. You can all decide how old you think Howie is and how old you think I am, which is, this was 50 years plus 1 day, to the day, according to the Gregorian calendar, after the Yom Kippur War broke out. And there were 2 or 3 things they had in common. One was a total surprise. 2 was some kind of fiasco of military planning. We're going to find out. People are going to be writing books about it for decades. But the third was that it happened on a day when many people were in synagogue, or at least disconnected from their phones, etc. So people were being called up. People who were Shomer Shabbat and don't normally listen to their phones, but are of the age between 20 and 40, had to turn on their phones because they might be called up. So there was this sort of we went back to the 19th century. People were going from house to house saying, did you hear what happened? And of course, ultimately, it was, how did this happen? It's not the only thing about the personal experience, and people are going to write books about this in the future, and we don't need to dwell on it today, but it is this sort of, I think a month later, people are still waking up in the morning and saying, how?
That October 7th was a horrible day. And we tend just to hear about it in numbers. You both said you have, close connections to people who were in harm's way then. Maybe turn this a little more personal. Tell us something about one or two of those people, because I just hate the way it all gets lost in numbers. So whoever wants to go first.
I have an important one, and it's not, it happens that some of the people who've been on the ride in past years will have met this person. That's why it's so significant. And that's Adele Reamer from Kibbutz Nirim, who often speaks to some of the groups, between Chalutzim and Shomrim and Sofim, and who's in a hurry and who had the water stop in this place. Some of you might have missed her, but she often speaks to some of the group at the Black Arrow about life on the border with Gaza. And Adele is my age, came here 40 years ago, and she's a friend of mine personally. I was actually in the army with her husband many years ago, and she's a cousin of Gil Troy, etc. Anyway, she speaks both about peacemaking, because she lived on the Gaza border, but she also lived on the Gaza border back when she had good relationships with people in Gaza. When she would go there shopping, and some of them would come and work on a kibbutz, and she had relationships with people in Gaza in and during every war. Even while Israel was bombing Gaza and Gaza was bombing Israel, she was exchanging text messages with people. When I got back from synagogue after having said, okay, now I'm going to turn on the computer, I saw the time she was live blogging on her Facebook page, and the Times of Israel, if some of you read it, was picking it up and putting it, constantly updating their Ops and Blogs page, where her story, she was locked in her mamad, her reinforced safe room, yeah. Listening to people being shot outside, listening to Hamas storming through her kibbutz, shooting people, shooting children, shooting old people, breaking into houses. And she knew that 3 doors away was her son-in-law and her small grandchildren. But she couldn't get to them, and they couldn't get to her. And obviously either would be risking their lives trying to join each other. And so she just sat there for 8 hours, waiting for something, waiting for the army to save them, waiting for somebody to come. But she live blogged the whole thing. You can still read it on the Times of Israel if you're interested. And night came, and I didn't know if she was alive or dead. And she survived, and actually her son-in-law and the grandchildren survived, because her son-in-law had a gun in the house, and he sat in the living room and locked his small children in the mamad, in the sealed room, came back to check up on them once in a while. He sat there, and when the terrorists came into his house, he shot them dead on the spot. Just sitting on the couch. As soon as he saw me, he shot them, and no other terrorists came into that house. It was random. There's 200 houses on a kibbutz. They're running around, shooting people, dragging people away. It could have, and she was just lucky. They didn't come into her house, or they did come into her house. They come into her house, they ate food, right? And then they left, and they didn't try to get her out of, they didn't know she was in the safe room. Who knows? She was on the kibbutz this weekend. Just happened to be visiting friends on Kibbutz Keturah. She's in Eilat with her extended family. And on the one hand, she's alive, her children are alive, her grandchildren are alive, her kibbutz is destroyed, her home is destroyed. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of her kibbutz, I know many people on that kibbutz, not just her, but some of you have met her before. Almost something like a quarter of a third of the people on the kibbutz are either dead or hostages. So she has experienced something that none of us will ever know. She flew to the States with a delegation to speak to groups. She spoke to congressmen and senators, etc. I bring her up as one example. There are 1,000 stories. You can read a lot of them, and I know some other people, more like the young people at the raves, etc. But because some of you might have met her or heard her speak, I thought I'd tell you her story. She's incredibly positive in spite of everything. Maybe she was putting on a show. It's hard to know. She's not my best friend, but she gave me a big hug, and so her entire kibbutz is now in a hotel, right? Trying to figure out what they're going to do with their lives. It's a community that's been completely destroyed and moved someplace else. Jared.
That's a tough act to follow, Bill. That's a very powerful
It's not
story.
an act. Halabayef was an act.
I didn't mean it that way. I just meant
yeah.
that's a very powerful story that
You remember
I knew
her.
I knew most of the story. Yes, of course. I know Adele quite well. I'll just share. I'll keep mine really brief, mostly because I think the story that touched me in the most personal way, and certainly in the most emotional way, is a story that also might be very well known to our writing community, because it involves, in particular, one family that is quite well known from Jerusalem, both of whose parents are American, and that is the story of the music festival that took place on the beach, where the grossest part of the massacre took place. And as probably most of you are well aware by now, as the music festival was taking place, and the attack started to happen, there were quite a number of young partygoers who were able to get to a sort of a safe structure that was, at least during all of the chaos, was deemed by them in the confusion to be the best place to sort of hide out, because they were very aware that there were a lot of shots being fired. There were explosive devices being set off, and they wanted to at least just protect themselves from fast moving objects. As these a very large number, I don't remember the exact number, but as a large number of these young people were all sort of crowded into this safe space, apparently a number of the Hamas terrorists had located them, knew that there were people inside, and decided to start throwing grenades inside the structure. At that point, two of the young people who had done one was in the middle of his army service. The other one was sort of almost finished with his army service. They sort of decided to take leadership of this kind of unexpected community under their wing. And so they stood at the entrance trying to catch the grenades and throw them out, knowing full well that in such a defined closed space with a lot of people cowering for safety, that any explosive would probably take most of their lives. And as the story played out, we only learned all of the details later. But one of those young men, by the name of Hirsch Polin Goldberg, the son of John Polin and Rachel Goldberg, again, both of whom who are American immigrants to Israel. He had one of his arms, or part of his lower arm, blown off, and was eventually taken hostage, and is presumed to be still one of the 200 plus, I think it's now 244 was the last number I saw, hostages in Gaza, although most of their fates are very unclear, very unknown, because there has not been a lot of communication or signs of life. And only much later, there was documentary evidence of him being taken hostage. So his parents, who have now become one of the, or two, I should say, of the faces of this, international campaign to try to release and rescue all of the captives. They have been at the UN. They have had press conferences. They've been all over the news. They were on the cover of Time magazine. So many of you might know them, might be familiar with their faces. And so Hirsch himself has become very much one of the symbols, certainly for American Jews, of this particular element of what happened on October 7th. Sadly, his best friend, who was the other young man at the entrance to that kind of safe structure who were catching and throwing back grenades, his body was discovered only a day or two later, with a grenade in his hand. His dead body was discovered. He apparently couldn't get the grenade out in time, and so he apparently, according to the forensics, covered the grenade with his body, and thus absorbed the blow, dying. It turns out that while Hirsch's parents are very close friends of mine, we're old friends from our time in Jerusalem. And the other young man, whose name is Aner Shapira, who I didn't know him personally, but I didn't realize until later that I know his parents, and they live just down the street from me. We literally live just a few houses away from each other. And I only found out about 24 hours after that fact that he and my daughter, who is currently studying in the United States, knew each other quite well. So that sort of hit us in a very, raw, personal way, even though it technically wasn't family, wasn't relations. It was somebody that we knew. Both of those families we know quite well, and they're very much a part of our Jerusalem scene.
Thank you. We all hear about sirens going off at various points in time. Jared, maybe talk about what it's like, what really happens, in Jerusalem. How often has it been happening, and what do you do, and how does your whole family relate to that? What does it turn into on a human level?
Well, for better and for worse, sirens going off in Israel is it's a part of Israeli life. It's sort of awful to say that, but it's something that's been going on long enough that many, many Israelis, certainly not all, but many Israelis are very aware of what it sounds like, what it feels like, what the emotional reaction is, and what you're meant to do. So it's good in the way that when the siren finally goes off, generally speaking, most people kind of have a gut reaction to it. They know exactly where they're supposed to go or what they're supposed to do, how to protect their family. Kids in schools have generally undergone, sort of a training day, so they know where to go and how to be calm. Not that it always plays out perfectly. Obviously, the sad aspect of that is that this is, unfortunately, a part of the reality of living in Israel. As a Jerusalemite, I should add that we have a certain amount of privilege, maybe not quite as much as our dear friends on Kibbutz Keturah, who are maybe just a little bit further out of range, although not anymore. But at least traditionally speaking, with the rockets that are coming from Gaza Strip, Jerusalem has enough of a distance that it allows us about a minute and a quarter to get to a safe space, right? That is compared to those who live in what's called the Gaza envelope, the cities of Sderot and Ofakim and the kibbutzim that Bill was just talking about, where Adele was from, where they have, anywhere between 15 and 25 seconds, depending on where they live. So certainly for those of us in Jerusalem, when the siren goes off, there's obviously going to be a little bit of panic. It's mostly, I would say, a very controlled, measured response. And it's sort of dampened a certain amount because we know we have roughly 90 seconds. So you don't enter into that phase of, oh my God, I'm running for my life. You simply, throw your clothes on, run downstairs to the bomb shelter, or enter into your safe room if you have one, if you're in a more modern apartment. Many Jerusalem apartment buildings are older and they don't have enough safe rooms. So there's a lot of kind of gathering that takes place in the bomb shelters that are in almost every building. And if you don't have a bomb shelter in your building, there are community bomb shelters, and everybody usually knows where that is in the neighborhood. And again, as a Jerusalemite, you have time to be able to access those safe spaces. And then once you're in those safe spaces, there's a lot of checking news, sharing news, checking in with each other. There's a lot of community building that sort of unexpectedly happens, where people are just making sure everybody's safe, taking care of people who do not feel safe, who are panicking, and then making sure that as we listen to the directives of the Home Front Command, we wait the proper amount of time, which in Jerusalem is about 10 minutes, to make sure that if a missile falls, it has already fallen, and then it is safe to leave the safe space and go back about your business. So that's kind of the Jerusalem experience of the rocket sirens in general.
And Bill, for those people who don't know what's gone on at Torah lately, just the
Oh,
norm and
the sirens. Well,
Torah,
last week
talk
there was
about
a, it's kind of crazy, but last week there was I wonder if this made it into the American news. Last Wednesday, it might have been, maybe it was Thursday. There was a missile fired at a lot from Yemen. That is, if I'm not mistaken, 1,000 miles away. And it was taken down by the Arrow, which is an Israeli anti-missile thingamajig. I mean, some of you might be engineers. I really don't understand these things, even when I read about them. But that was kind of insane. We were kind of blown away they can make it that far. And it was the Houthis. The Houthis, if you've been reading about the Yemenite civil war, are actually aiding the Hezbollah and the Hamas. They are also Iranian proxies. And then yesterday, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a 4:30, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a missile that was shot down over Kibbutz Keturah. It was headed for a lot from Gaza. And the sirens actually went off, and we were all supposed to go to our bomb shelters. And I just sat in front of the computer because I was completely certain that it was a drill. But we're all okay, and we are not in any imminent danger, and maybe we are being a little bit well, we're not being nonchalant because the kibbutz has been turned into a fortress starting with day one. So we're certainly taking it seriously, but anyway, that's where we're at.
So that's a good segue. Bill, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and the kibbutz has been doing since October 7th.
So the first thing that happened was our kibbutz is sort of I think we lost Jared for a minute there, but maybe he'll be back. You might have some connection problems. But anyway, the first thing, our kibbutz is sort of, as everybody's been on the Israel ride knows Torah. That's what's great about this conversation. But our kibbutz is the country's bomb shelter. That is to say, when there is a war, whether it's in Gaza or on the Lebanese border or anything, everyone remembers that they have friends and family on kibbutz Keturah. So that day, the kibbutz Keturah doubled in size. Not just children and grandchildren, obviously, who filled up people's houses, and we don't have very large houses, but it's an emergency. But every spare room, every spare house, there were even people with camper vans. The kibbutz literally doubled in size, which first of all meant that people had we had to feed twice as many people. And suddenly we needed a lot of help in the kitchen and a lot of help in the dining room. But also this is indefinite. There is no question, there's no sense that this is going to be over in a few days or even in a few weeks, and maybe not even in a few months. They've come and gone. So some leave and join family members somewhere else in the country, but then others take their place. And at a certain point, I realized that I have 2 spare bedrooms. Once I was sure that my daughters who live in Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Newton were not going to be coming to stay on Kibbutz Keturah for an extended period. I went to the woman who was coordinating all this, and I said, look, I have 2 spare bedrooms in my house because at the home we raised 3 children here. If you want to send a family here. So she sent the next day, 9 o'clock in the morning, I was already on the phone with one of the husbands, 2 women with each one with a 2-year-old, one with a 3-year-old, came down and stayed in my house for a couple of weeks. Ultimately, one of them a few days later went up north and flew to Switzerland. She had a friend in Switzerland. She said, I'm just going to wait out the war in Switzerland with a 3-year-old daughter. But the other woman, who didn't even speak Hebrew or English, she was Russian, and we communicated in sign language for 2 weeks, and I helped her take care of her 2-year-old, and that was quite an experience. Eventually she left, but tomorrow I'm planning on telling the woman who's coordinating this that I have room again. If you want to send another family my way, I'm happy to take them on. The other thing that happened, which backtracking to the fact that the kibbutz immediately, 10 members of the kibbutz who are, first of all, like I said previously, that a lot of people got called up. Anybody between the age of 20 and 40 might have been called up. The country drafted 360,000 people, not counting the 180,000 that are already in the army. So 500,000 people out of a country of 10 million, when you break it down into, how many are actually army age, it's a significant, and army age and not ultra-Orthodox and not Arab, you get to a pretty large percent of the people who could be holding a gun at all. were drafted. 10 of them were officially drafted and made the Kitat Konanut, which I always forget. How would you translate that, Jared? Never mind. The core of people who are defending Kibbutz Keturah.
A local security force.
Very good. Local security force. And the kibbutz was turned into a fortress. All the gates of the kibbutz were closed. There were sort of bunkers set up in various corners of the kibbutz. Each one of those people knew where to go. At all times, there is two people guarding the front gate, and one person patrolling, and one person on full alert, like wearing full military garb with a gun. They can sit down, they can read the paper, they can maybe even take a nap on the couch, but they're basically talking 3 in the morning till 7 in the morning, whatever. My job, so I immediately volunteered. Now, here's the interesting thing, which Jared also shares. The next day, of course, all my tour groups for October, November, December, including the Israel ride, were obviously canceled. And so I suddenly had some free time on my hands while in between running around after this 2-year-old that I couldn't speak to. I volunteered to do 4 hours a day at the front gate because in addition to the soldier, during daylight hours, there's always a second person who is just a member of the kibbutz who identifies people. They come up to the front gate in the car or even on foot, and I say, "Who are you?" etc., etc. And since I've been here for 42 years, I know most of them, but if I don't, I need to ask a few more questions. And of course, eventually they get in, but it took a while for everybody to get used to that. Now every community in the country is like that. And everyone in the kibbutz is volunteering to do something because one of the largest concentrations of evacuees, as we call them, even though there are a lot on Kibbutz Keturah, one of the largest concentration of evacuees is in Eilat. So there are people going in there to do some craft projects with kids. There are people going in there to help with food deliveries. Here on the kibbutz, we have a whole informal education set up for the little kids. So the first and second and third graders, they're on like Zoom the school age kids are on Zoom education, which is kind of absurd. We're sort of back to COVID times, but the kids under that age, they don't have anywhere to go. They can't be in the kibbutz Keturah kindergartens. There's no room. They don't know the other kids, etc. So we've set up a special kindergarten thing, which once a week, David Jaffe will recognize this. Once a week, I show up with a guitar and do children's songs with them. That's what I know how to do. I mean, everybody knows what that is. Somebody else is making cookies and somebody else is helping them, is doing yoga. I mean, there's a whole community here who have been evacuated from their homes, and all of them are a little bit traumatized, and almost all of them have people very close to them who have been killed or taken hostage, because these aren't just people who know some people near Gaza. These are people whose lives have been there. That's, Kibbutz Keturah is in a totally different place, except that, we're also still growing dates. But here's the crazy thing. This is something very few people know. Probably not even Howie knows this, but let's see. 54 of the hostages are from Thailand. 54. Almost a quarter of the hostages are agricultural workers from Thailand, because these were all kibbutzim, and they were very vulnerable. They didn't even they didn't know what's going on. They're wandering around, what's going on. Boom, they're being taken hostages one after another. So there were 15 Thai workers on Kibbutz Keturah, in addition to all the agriculture that we young Zionists do. We also hire these nice people from Thailand. The king said, everybody come home. They all went home. Israel is literally agriculturally cut off at the knees. In fact, people are now volunteering to go pick peppers in all sorts of places, also people from Keturah. I know this is a horrible way of putting it, but if basically you said every farm worker in California or the west of the Mississippi has to go back to their country of origin tomorrow, it would be an agricultural crisis in the United States, unparalleled. That's also going on. Yeah, I don't know how I got there, but I was just saying how there's this sort of ripple effect. Everything affects everything. So even though we obviously have all the people in the kibbutz who work in the date trees going down every day, but they're seriously understaffed because they also worked with these Thai people. I got a little off track there, but I think
some of the big corporations in Israel are offering grants to college students who are obviously not having classes to go
Yeah.
work at Shura, work in the Gaza envelope in the fields to keep this agricultural kind of thing going. It's a huge problem.
I mean, I do want to say, and this gets back to a previous question. I don't want to talk too much more, but just an example. My daughter was here this weekend. My youngest daughter, Hetty, who lives in Jerusalem. She's a student at Hebrew University, and next year, I mean, this was supposed to be the beginning of her second year of college, and of course, classes haven't started because half the students and many of the professors are off at war or whatever. She's just waiting for it to start. So they keep saying, okay, it'll start in November, no, it'll start in December, etc. She's working, and but she's basically not sleeping at night because she's at an age, and my daughter is an extremely social person. She has a huge number of friends, and all of them are affected by this, including her roommate, who's a woman. Her roommate is a fighting paramedic with the Navy. She's basically floating around in the Mediterranean, shooting at terrorists who are still trying to make it to Israeli shores. But that's the closest you get. But everybody she knows is affected by this. It's her age bracket. She's a kibbutz kid, so she has tons of youth movement kid, everything, and it's like she said, she's fine. She knows she's fine. She's in Jerusalem, which is relatively safe, but she's not sleeping at night. She's also worried about me, which is ridiculous, but that's I think that's just anxiety. So it's a whole country on various planes of worry.
Jared, how about you? How has what has the last month been like for you, and what have you been doing?
Well, unlike Kibbutz Keturah, I live in a very urban setting. So the experience in Jerusalem has been, I would say, probably quite different, given that, we can't immediately bond together as a community and sort of decide how we're gonna help as one. So things have been, on one hand, much more chaotic in Jerusalem. There have been many organizations, many initiatives, many groups of people who have been sort of fumbling to try to figure out what to do. The good news is that many of these initiatives came together unbelievably and inspirationally fast, such that there are now two major, what they're calling war rooms, which is a very unfortunate name because they're doing literally anything other than war. One in Jerusalem and one in Tel Aviv that perhaps somewhat ironically grew out of the protest movement that has consumed Israel since early January. As I'm sure many of our community of writers knows, that Israel has been in the throes of a struggle over defining what is a democracy. And so out of that very powerful civic movement where people were turning out on the streets, hundreds of thousands every Saturday night after Shabbat, grew this kind of immediate pivot and response to the needs of war. Obviously, people did not feel comfortable going out onto the streets to protest the government or for the government, but everybody did feel the need to stay together and keep those connections alive in order to help. And so while my first and immediate sort of response to the war was to deal with the student groups that actually were in Jerusalem that I was actively teaching, and they all really wanted to leave. So we had to find creative ways to get them out of the country. And that generally meant crossing the border with Jordan and sort of busing them out to the airport in Amman so they could fly home. Once I was able to deal with them, because they were largely my responsibility while they were here, I and my kids were able to sort of join with so many of the rest of Jerusalem in volunteering for these various efforts, right, to come together and respond to needs as they were. On one hand, Jerusalem, like Eilat and the Dead Sea region, now plays home to about a third of all of the evacuated families and communities from both the Gaza area and the northern border. So there are many, many families that are now calling Jerusalem hotels home. and they were evacuated very quickly, and so therefore they did not bring enough material goods with them. They need a lot of services, they need assistance. So there's a lot to do regarding those specific families. But also, given that Jerusalem is a central city, it's a capital city, it has a lot of resources, certainly people power. Many Jerusalemites, including myself, have been active in doing activities where we are then providing either services or goods to the rest of the country, either to hospitals or to those serving the general public, or maybe some of the army units. I have spent endless nights working in a bakery, making baked goods and mostly breads that sort of get disseminated around the country. I have been part of a project. Bill's going to laugh when I say this, but I have been part of a project cooking vegan food for all of those out in the field who suffer from the lack of quality, healthy food to sort of nourish them as they are safeguarding the rest of us Israelis. There have been so many wonderful activities that I've been a part of, and it often changes from day to day. So there's, again, because we're not a community like Kibbutz Keturah, every day when we wake up, the needs are being reassessed and redefined. And so we're all on WhatsApp groups and we're all getting the messages, and then we're immediately responding. So we never always know what we're going to be doing from day to day. In addition to that, I'll just share two quick things that I'm doing sort of my own accord. One is because, as Bill said, we have no access to tourists or students. I teach in the international community. None of my students can get to Israel, and so I have nobody to teach in person. So I decided that I wanted one of my volunteer activities to make myself available as a resource to those different groups around the world that I have relationships with. So I have now been spending a lot of time on Zoom, either teaching or explaining or conversing or sort of being an unlicensed therapist for people that just have a lot of questions or want to hear about things that are going on the ground. So I've been averaging about 2 Zoom sessions a day because apparently people are very frustrated with the lack of information or lack of understanding. And the other thing that I've been a part of, which won't surprise anybody who has ridden with me or knows who I am, and that is that part of my day-to-day educational life, in the same way that I am deeply connected to the Arava Institute, is working with a lot of other social justice and social change communities. And so I've been trying to keep those activities as active as possible, given that, in my opinion, those are the relationships that are going to get us out of this, repetitive cycle of conflict, when eventually we deal with the more pressing issues at hand, like the military aspect, like the hostages, the emotional suffering and trauma. Eventually, we're going to need to go back to figuring out how to all live in the same land together. And so I've been very active with those organizations, trying to maintain some of these really important relationships, like the Arava Institute does, these cross-border relationships with Israelis and Palestinians, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, simply to make sure that we don't lose sight of each other during this very, very difficult time, given that sadly we're all suffering to certain extents.
Thank you. If people have questions, why don't you put them in the chat, and we'll get people to answer some questions. I see a question in the chat that about the Arava Institute. What's happening at the Institute now? Have the Arab students remained? The answer is the Institute is functioning. The Arab students have remained. There have been 2 or 3 webinars that Tariq Abu Hamid, the executive director of the Institute, has done to talk about that. We're not the ones to really share those details. We will send a link to those recordings out to people on this chat. We are in the midst of the Israel ride is about all of us having a wonderful time and building a wonderful community, but it's really about raising money for the Arava Institute, which I think, as we all understand, is one of these now more than ever or when this is when the military conflict subsides, that we're going to need what the RFI Institute brings to us. Many of you have already agreed to take the fundraising that you've done for this year and give it to the Institute. I encourage others who haven't done that yet to think about that. To those of you who are alumni, we're about to start a campaign to all of our alumni, and trying to raise money for the RFI Institute to continue what it does. Yes, there are urgent needs now, making sure people have food and underwear and soldiers have socks, and all of those things are important. But the Institute can be and should be a part of all of our futures. And so your support will be very much appreciated and welcomed. But to hear more about the Institute, we will send those things around. And how come I can't find it?
I just want to say,
Howie?
Yep.
Go ahead, Bill.
Just about the RFI Institute question. I was sitting with a couple of Arab students from the RFI Institute, a lovely young couple, Israeli Palestinians, and obviously the question about Arab students is a legitimate one, but there are Israeli Palestinians, West Bank Palestinians, Jordanian Palestinians, Jordanian Bedouin, and none of those groups are a monolithic group either. So it's like everybody has a different perspective. But I was sitting with a couple of Palestinian Israelis, from Israeli citizens, and I was saying, somebody else asked them, is there tension between the Arabs and Israeli, or Jewish Israelis and Arabs in the RFI Institute because of what's going on? And they said, no, the biggest fights are between the left-wing Israelis and right-wing Israelis. Even during the war, that's who does the most arguing. And I was like, well, that's Jews for you. But the RFI Institute, I think for a lot of those people, is a bit of a haven. After all, they're a little bit self-sorted. You have to have an open mind to coexistence to study there at all. But so for them, this might be not the best place to be because, there's all sorts of pressures coming from home. But I think Tariq and the staff of the RFI Institute do an incredible job at allowing them to process and working through this stuff.
We're also, I'm not sure if the email went out or not, but I'll give you a chance, Jared, in a sec. Next week, or over the next couple of weeks, we're doing a couple more of these webinars, and one or two of them will be with crew or people who were going to be crew or have been crew on the Israel ride. So you can get, not the secondhand perspective that Bill and Jared can bring, but the firsthand perspective of some of these folks. And as I guess it was Bill just said, none of these groups are monolithic. They all have a lot of, anyway, Jared, go ahead. Sorry.
Actually, I just wanted to strengthen one of the things that Howie started with, in that, and this is a direct response actually to you, Brenda and David, and your question in the chat. And it's going to sound a little biased, but I'm trying to share it as a very honest, genuine opinion, in that the organizations like the RFI Institute that are currently out of focus, right, given the intense attention being paid to the military conflict and to the plight of those who are suffering the most at the moment, right? Those who live on the borders, on both sides of the borders. But so these organizations, which are doing such amazing and important work, in my opinion, are the ones, as Howie said, that are going to lead us beyond this conflict. When we finish dealing with these issues, however long that takes, we have to go back to something. And I think we certainly in this community can all agree that organizations like the RFI Institute are the ones that are gonna build a future that we can really thrive on. Generally speaking, when I'm not talking to an Israel Ride community, there are many other also of those similar organizations that are doing great work, but I'm clearly not going to mention their names now because we want to focus all of our attention on the Arava Institute. And I'll just strengthen that one bit more by saying that while you are hearing many appeals from Israel, from the Jewish community in North America, for urgent needs, material supplies, goods, foods, even services, I just want to caution people that most of those campaigns are being overplayed. I don't want to be too cynical, but I just want to caution folks that while there are obviously needs at play here, it's important to remember that Israel is a first world country, although we've been struggling a little bit recently with our economy, mostly thanks to a bit of political crisis. We do have a very strong economy. We have pretty much everything that we need. We just need to focus on redistributing it. And so if you're wondering, right, do I send socks to a soldier, or do I somehow support an organization that is building the relationships that's going to hopefully prevent the next round of conflict happen? I would certainly confidently say, don't worry about the soldier. They are getting plenty of socks and toothbrushes. The evacuated families will eventually get all of the needs that they currently have. But what I would encourage everybody is to think twice about where they want to sort of devote their attention, their resources, and how they want to contribute. Because I think organizations like the Arava Institute are going to get lost amongst this sort of cloud of urgency and immediacy. And I think we all know and we all love the work that is being done and the potential that it has. So I just leave it there.
Bill, any last words? Unless I don't see any more questions in the chat, and we're running towards the end of the time. Anything you want to add, Bill?
I will say, and it's not even, you can't even call it a silver lining in a black cloud. But I will say one positive thing, which is for the past 10 months, this country has been torn apart at the seams, as you know. Hundreds of thousands of people going to protest every Saturday night, a relatively extremist government, and antipathy between sort of two Israels sort of arguing with each other, and it all disappeared on one day. Country became incredibly united. There's what you disagree with politically, and then there is pure evil. And suddenly we realized that we have a job to do. And what Jared said is absolutely true. When all this is over, we have to find a way of living in peace in the Middle East. And but it certainly brought the country together, ironically. And thank you. I keep seeing thank yous appear, and all of you people. I wish I was riding a bike through the desert with you now. I think of you every morning when I go up the Crazy People's Hill, and we'll do it again in a year.
So that's a great segue to you all should be getting an email next week opening registration for the 2024 Israel Ride.
Howie, go for it.
Yep. So come join us.
If he didn't say something, I was going to. So
we expect to sell out. So sign up early, and get going on your fundraising early, because we need people not just to raise the minimum, but to raise more than the minimum for this wonderful, wonderful institute that the ride supports and that needs to be an integral part of the future of the Middle East. So thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe, and hopefully things will move forward in as best a way possible, whatever that means, over the next month or two. And better times will be ahead of us. Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.
Thanks very much.